Welcome to the channel, everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about hammers and dollies and how they affect the metal. Now, a lot of this information I've covered in other videos, but I'm going to try and put everything that I know about them in this one video. There's a little bit more details to hammer and dollies than you might think, so I'm going to try and cover everything, break everything down, show you step by step what a hammer and dolly actually does to the metal. And if you've run into problems before trying to repair a dent and the metal isn't doing what you want it to do, there's a reason behind it. So hopefully this video will give you a little bit more insight of how hammers and dollies work. The first thing I'm going to talk about is on the dolly hammering and off the dolly hammering. So let me show you on my magic whiteboard again what I'm talking about. Okay, first up is off the dolly. Now on this diagram here, there's a dent right here in the sheet metal. You're going to put the pressure underneath the dent with the dolly and use your hammer and hit on both sides of it, not directly on it. And this will actually move the metal into place and it won't cause any stretching to the metal. Now if you look at the other diagram, this is what most guys probably do, and this is where you can get into problems. You're using that dolly to back up the dent, you're hammering on the top of it, and this will cause metal stretching because when that metal gets hammered in between, they're sandwiched in between, it'll get compressed and it has to go somewhere, and it can't really go out on either side because it's held into place with the rest of the panel. So that's where it'll start to oil cannon. You'll get that spot that's either too high, too low, and you can't get it to stay where you want it. So most of the hammering and dollying you're going to do on sheet metal is going to be off the dolly. You'll get better results with it. You won't stretch the metal. And off the dolly hammering is probably going to account for usually around 80 to 90% of all your metal straightening. Okay, let's talk about the hammers and the dollies we're going to be using. I've mentioned this before in other videos. These two hammers here probably get most of the use. I just like the way these feel. I like the weight of them, the balance, so I use these two most of the time. One thing about these hammers, if you look at the face of them, and I don't care what kind you've got, I've checked all of these, and none of them have a flat surface. They all have a crown to them, and you can actually see that by putting it on the dolly, how it rolls back and forth there on a straight edge. So when you're hammering on something, you're not getting the full impact of this surface area here. It's kind of confined to just the center. So that's why it's compressing the metal when you're hammering on it. The pressure isn't distributed across the whole face of the hammer. It's right in the center. Or even if it's off center, you're going to be hitting on an edge. You're just hammering on a small space there. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is actually the dollies. And the dollies, I think, a little bit more important than the hammers. And the two that I use most of the time is these toe dollies. They're called toe dollies because they kind of resemble a foot with the big toe being here, tapering down to the little toe here. But it's a toe dolly. This is actually a heel dolly. It looks like the heel on a shoe. These two dollies here I use most of the time, and one is thinner than the other, and there's a reason. And I'm going to show you how the weight of these dollies affect your metal. And like I said, these dollies are probably more important to your repair process than the hammer. I've got another dolly here. Let me see where it's at. Now I've got one here I can explain a little bit better. Oh, here it is over here. Let me get it. Okay, this dolly here, I don't use it too much on cars. It's just a little bit too awkward to move around. This is a little bit easier way to explain it. If you ever been to a Pioneer Village or a living history display and you see a blacksmith working, the anvil, besides supporting the work, it actually takes the pressure from the hammer and returns it up into the piece of metal he's working on. The hammer puts pressure into it and the anvil bounces pressure right back. So it's basically like it's a 2-for-1. So every hammer strike, it's getting the power of 2 hammer strikes. One comes from the hammer, the other strike comes back from the anvil. Okay, let's look at this hood I've got here. There's a dent in it right here. I'm going to take my hammer from underneath and bump on this. No dolly on top. I'm just going to get underneath here and hammer on it. it a little bit, but not all that much. Now, let's see what happens when I set my dolly on there. Okay, with that dolly on there, that dent's coming up a whole lot quicker. I don't even have to use as much force underneath with the hammer, and it's bringing it up. But at the same time, I can overstretch it. And right there, it's pretty good. But if I keep hammering on that, and it's actually raised up quite a bit. It's got a pretty good knot in it now. So that's what the dolly does. It puts that force back into this metal. When you're hammering on it, you're actually almost getting a 2-for-1, just like on the anvil. Okay, when I hammered on this from underneath with just a hammer and no dolly, it was moving the metal, but very slow, and it didn't stretch anything. Put the heavy dolly on that dent and hammer on it with the same hammer, and it's starting to stretch it. It's bringing it up way too high. You need something that's in between no dolly and this heavy dolly. Well, that's where the little thinner, lighter dolly comes in. The sheet metal is pretty thin. Now, if I'd hammer on that with this, it wouldn't stretch it so bad. Let's put another dent in here. I'm going to use this lighter weight dolly on here and see what happens. Okay, it's bringing it up nice and even. It's not stretching it. It's actually working up pretty good. It's a little bit low right there, and I could keep going on it, but I think you get the idea. It doesn't have a high spot in it like this does. So that's the difference between a heavy dolly and a light dolly. On this thin sheet metal like this hood, the lightweight dolly is going to straighten this better without causing more problems. So there's a difference between using no dolly at all, a heavy dolly, and a thin dolly, and I hope that explained that part of it. Let me show you what happens with a pick hammer. All right, this area of the hood right here, there's no damage on it, no dents or anything. I'm going to use this pick hammer and a heavy dolly somewhere right in here, and then I'll take the light dolly, put it underneath here, and I'll give them about the same amount of hits, see which one stretches a little bit more. I can feel that already. And that was about 50 times I hit it. I'll try and do the same around right in this area. Right here was the heavy dolly. This was with the light dolly. Okay, now I'm going to hit over in this area with that same light pick hammer with no dolly. Okay, here's where I was hammering using a heavy dolly. This was the light dolly. And in this area here, I was using no dolly, and I don't see any raised spots. I don't see any dents. It's perfectly unchanged. That shows you right there what your dolly does when you're trying to straighten a piece of sheet metal. And like I've said before, I think the dolly does more work than the hammer does. Okay, I think you can see what the dolly does. It's very important, and like I said, I think it's a little bit more important than the hammer you're using. So the weight of it affects the metal, and also a little bit of how much pressure you're putting on there, but mostly it has to do with the weight. So you can see what happens when there's no dolly versus a heavy dolly versus a light dolly. That affects the way the metal is going to move. It's going to affect the way your panel comes out when you're trying to straighten it. So it also should help you to understand if you're having trouble getting a dent out or if you're overstretching something. That'll wrap it up for this video. Thanks for watching.